What's the deal with Empyreans? What's special about them? How powerful could they get, and who's interested in using that power? Let's jump right into this accursed item description, Remembrance of the Rot Goddess. It says, Miquella and Melania are both the children of a single god. As such, they are both Empyreans, but suffered afflictions from birth. I've seen quite a bit of disagreements about what this is saying. I think these sentences have several valid interpretations just looking at the grammar. The rest of the evidence found throughout the game can then help us narrow it down from there. First, let's briefly look at the but part. It's saying that they have these afflictions, and since it uses the word but, their afflictions somehow contradict a previous assumption. Which assumption? It's not clear. Maybe you don't expect Empyreans to be afflicted, maybe you don't expect children of a single god to be afflicted. I think the latter makes more sense, but I don't think it makes much difference either way. It's also ambiguous whether or not these sentences contain any explanation for why the twins are afflicted. Again, I'd rather not dwell on this and instead focus on the Empyrean part. So now let's forget the but part. Now we're just dealing with, they're children of a single god, as such they're Empyreans. You could interpret this as helpfully providing us the definition of the word Empyrean as children of a single god. If so, then any Empyrean must be the child of a single god, and any child of a single god must be an Empyrean. So that's one interpretation, and it makes this a very powerful statement. I favor a different interpretation, where this is just a conditional statement. If this first part happens, then this second part has to also happen. It's like if I said I got hit with Melania's Scarlet Aeonia, as such I became infected with the Scarlet Rot. If that's the case, and you hear that someone got hit with the Scarlet Aeonia, then can you conclude that they got infected? Yes, you can. But if you heard that someone is infected with Scarlet Rot, can you conclude that they got hit with the Aeonia? No. There are many ways to get rotted, and here I was only describing one of them. And this is how I interpret this item description. A child of a single god will definitely be an Empyrean, but there could be other ways to be an Empyrean also. By the way, when it says children of a single god, what does it mean by god exactly? There are various sorts of gods in Elden Ring. Queen Marika is called a god, and there are also these things called outer gods, and they're not the same thing. Outer gods are rather mysterious, and while the Greater Will is never explicitly called that, I do count it as one. For gods like Marika, meanwhile, I will use the term vessel god. So when the Remembrance talks about the children of a god, I'd say it's referring to a vessel god. From this description, I also infer that being an Empyrean is somewhat hereditary. If a vessel god somehow reproduces with just themselves, their child is only inheriting from them. Vessel gods are Empyreans, so then the child is also an Empyrean. And to extrapolate a bit, if a vessel god has a child with someone who's not a vessel god, which Marika did a fair bit of, then there is a decent chance that the child is an Empyrean, but far from a guarantee. Ranni is such an example, and those like Mohg or Rykard show that not all such children are Empyreans. And if two Empyreans have a kid? I really don't know. Maybe it's guaranteed, but I'd guess there's at least a high chance. And aside from that, I think anyone could be born as an Empyrean. I think it's very rare and happens randomly, but it does happen sometimes. Not unlike being born as an omen, perhaps. I'd guess that Marika was such an Empyrean, a random spontaneous case. Not every Empyrean needs a special heritage to explain their existence. Okay, but what is an Empyrean? I'd say what defines an Empyrean is an inborn sensitivity to outer gods. Empyreans are capable of channeling these strange entities and have the potential to become vessel gods. This gives them potential to wield great power, but also to be meddled with by otherworldly forces. By the way, there is some talk of the Two Fingers choosing Empyreans. However, I think this just means they're somehow able to detect a person's innate sensitivity to outer gods. So I think the fingers are more dowsing rods and less kingmakers. Nonetheless, early awareness could be a very valuable thing, as I'll explain soon. That brings me to a slightly different topic. What's the point of an Elden Lord? Why are there Elden Lords? Quite consistently, Elden Lords are consorts to vessel gods, so I think the reason Elden Lords are an institution at all is basically to breed more Empyreans. That doesn't always seem to make sense sexually, but that doesn't seem to be a big obstacle for vessel gods. But what's the point of trying to create more Empyreans? This is where I really start to theorize. I think this is an institution created by outer gods. Well, the idea of an Elden Lord seems to be tied to the Greater Will specifically, but the general idea seems like it's stuck. Ranni can take a Lord, for instance, but I don't know that it would be an Elden Lord, nor would her outer god be the Greater Will. Anyway, I think the outer gods want their vessel gods to have a Lord consort. They want more Empyreans. And on the surface, I find this maybe a bit weird. If we look at Marika, for example, she was able to wield huge amounts of power on behalf of the Greater Will, and molds the lands between to the Greater Will's liking. Hasn't the Greater Will gotten what it's wanted? Why does it need more Empyreans running around? Ranni talks about Empyreans as potential replacements for Marika, and indeed, Marika's various kids ended up creating quite a mess, in part because of this replacement concept. Why should the Greater Will create this friction, create antagonists for its own vessel god, who's already doing what the Greater Will wants? Plus, it seems Empyreans could be sensitive to various outer gods. Melania, for instance, ended up connected to a different outer god from the Greater Will. So more Empyreans could mean more tools for the Greater Will's outer god rivals, only leading to less control over the lands between. So why should an outer god want its vessel god to take a lord and create more Empyreans? Well, for one, it seems like Marika sealing Destined Death was a unique event. It's not the usual state of affairs. And without that, I could see it either way, but I'm not sure how long-lived a Vessel God would be. They might be as mortal as anyone, so they'd need heirs, much like real-life monarchs. The ruler can't rule forever, even if they want to. But even aside from that, there's another reason. I don't know that an Outer God would want an eternal Vessel God, at least, not necessarily. That's because the Vessel God is not necessarily a very good servant. A first-generation Vessel God is more of a bootstrap, a first step, not a success in and of themselves. The next generation will do better, and who knows how many iterations this scheme would take. What's wrong with the first generation? First off, the first Vessel God was probably a random spontaneous Empyrean. They just happened to appear at some point. They have their own personal background, their own upbringing and culture and such. This biases their interests, so if an Outer God gives them power, they might not use it exactly how the Outer God wants. I think Marika removing the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring is an example of this. Marika expressed her own ideal there, which probably wasn't what the Greater Will preferred. Furthermore, this isn't really clear, but maybe an Empyrean is sensitive to Outer Gods in general. Various Outer Gods might be trying to channel through the same person. Who knows how that struggle shakes out? The eventual winner probably had to make some compromises to come out on top. Compromises are not ideal. Finally, there's just the imperfect process of wielding power over the lands between. This is well described by Rogier as that once present pliability of the Golden Order, absorbing various heterodox practices. Maybe that was a necessary evil at the time, but ultimately, the Outer God wants to have its way completely and reject everything else. So how is the next generation supposed to be any better? I think the main idea is that the next generation Empyrean will be raised under the watchful eye of their Vessel God parent, so the Outer God will have influence over its next Vessel's entire life. This is where the two fingers rapidly checking the Empyrean status of a royal infant can be very useful. Their ideology and upbringing could be carefully guided from birth, and perhaps they can even somehow be shielded or hidden from other Outer Gods that may want to meddle with them too. Eventually this Empyrean will become the new Vessel God and reshape the lands between even closer to the ideals of their Outer God. And again, maybe there are even further iterations, each generation getting the Outer God closer to what it wants. Does this idea bear out if we look at some second generation Empyreans? On the surface, it doesn't seem like it. It's not clear how much influence Marika, as Radagon, had on Ranni's upbringing. Partly that may have been a matter of Carian culture, but it was also exacerbated when Radagon left to become Elden Lord. Maybe that was a plan soiled by Marika's machinations. But Malenia immediately bonded to a different Outer God entirely. And what about Miquella? He and Radagon seemed to have extensive discussions about Golden Order fundamentalism, invented a few spells for each other, but ultimately, Miquella became disillusioned. Here is the parent Vessel God directly trying to influence the next generation Empyrean and failing. Is this whole plan a flop? Maybe not. Miquella gives up on Golden Order fundamentalism and starts working on what's called unalloyed gold. That's just what I've been saying. The Golden Order is only the first step from the Greater Will's perspective. The next generation shouldn't cleave to it perfectly. Quite the contrary, they should seek to remove the impurities. Stick with gold, but keep it unalloyed. So it may well be that Miquella learned exactly the lessons from Radagon that the Greater Will wanted him to learn. To put a more sinister twist on it, maybe even Malenia was part of that scheme. One of the reasons Miquella gives for rejecting the Golden Order is its inability to cure his sister. Could it be that the Greater Will intentionally sacrificed his twin Empyrean just to give Miquella more motivation? A dangerous gambit, but it seemed to do the trick. So maybe Miquella was the Greater Will second generation success story in progress. He was making his own new tree. He had enormous intellect and power. People just loved to obey him. It seems some were even suicide bombers. If this is all true, then it means Ranni's concerns may not have been relevant. The Greater Will doesn't need her as a vessel if it has Miquella. But nothing turns out quite as planned, and it all fell apart in the end. And how did Marika feel about all this? Would she want to ever be replaced? She sure had a bunch of kids. I think she was probably on board with the idea, with some caveats. I don't think she was willing to die, but if she could peaceably hand the reins to her more powerful and perfect child, I think she would have been okay with such an outcome. This may have been one of her aims in sealing Destined Death, but I don't know if keeping death out of the Elden Ring was going to fly long term. So some sort of conflict may have been inevitable, but who knows whether Marika knew that. Looking at it this way, Marika should have been thrilled with all the progress Miquella was making. Here was her golden child, finally beginning to succeed after so many disappointments. As Gideon says when he hears about Miquella's kidnapping, perhaps the Queen's sorrow was justified. Although he ultimately disagreed with her, Gideon is supposed to have somehow glimpsed into the will of Queen Marika, so his thoughts on what Marika valued may be fairly insightful. Yet Gideon's take on Miquella is somewhat convoluted. He's heard the rumors, and they all seem correct. Miquella enmeshing in the Halig tree, getting kidnapped, all that. Gideon then wonders what to do, considering that it might be safer to destroy the cocoon. If he's trying to follow Marika's will, that doesn't really make it sound like she supports Miquella. Well, maybe there's a difference between destroying the cocoon and destroying Miquella himself. and who knows whether Miquella has already been corrupted by the Formless Mother. Furthermore, despite explicitly introducing Miquella as a Shardbearer, Gideon shows no direct interest in gaining Miquella's Great Rune, even after he's been located in a seemingly vulnerable state. Even Ranni gets at least a little handwave, saying she supposedly cast aside her Great Rune, but when it comes to Miquella's Great Rune, Gideon is completely silent. So it's all a bit hard to interpret in any particular direction, but I maintain that Miquella was Marika's greatest hope for the future, and Gideon obeys her wishes, up until the final moment he decides to throw his life away as Godfrey's opening act. On the other hand, I'd guess Radagon may have soured on his heretic son. Radagon, Leal Hound, is an unbending fundamentalist. In his mind, the idea of improving on the Golden Order is a nonsensical contradiction in terms, but the timeline becomes tricky. Presumably, though not necessarily, Marika's sorrow contributed to shattering the Elden Ring. But did Mohg kidnap Miquella before receiving his Great Rune, or only after? Or did Marika foresee this event, but only hoped it wouldn't come to pass? Or maybe she expected that Radagon, once his powers reached their peak, would personally lead the charge against his own son Miquella. But now this is all about the shattering, while I'm trying to discuss Empyreans. I didn't even mention shadowbound beasts, supposedly ubiquitous companions to any Empyrean. There are various sorts of beasts everywhere, and they shouldn't be overlooked. As ever, almost nothing is clear or obvious, and almost everything is interconnected. Maybe I'll have to recant my ideas as I think further, but on the other hand, hopefully my current ideas provide a strong fuel and foundation for my future speculations.